Hello everyone, I hope you're having a calm and meaningful day. Today we'll explore a story about family, duty, and the quiet lies we tell out of fear. What happens when a father pretends to be dying? Not to deceive for gain, but to bring his children home one last time. If you're drawn to stories about emotional truth, moral choices, and fragile family bonds, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapter of this journey. Mr. Hoan sat alone in the old house, a place that once echoed with voices but now held only silence. The walls still carried the weight of memories, yet none of them spoke back. He coughed again, a dry, persistent sound that lingered longer than it should have. His breathing was heavy, uneven, as if each breath reminded him that time was no longer an ally. On the small wooden table in front of him lay an old family photograph. He reached for it slowly, his fingers trembling as they traced the faded faces of his two sons. James smiled brightly in the picture, unaware of the distance that would one day separate them. Hung stood beside him, expression more reserved, already carrying the seriousness that life would later sharpen. Mr. Hoan stared at the photo for a long time, his eyes clouded not by illness, but by fear. Fear of aging alone, fear of being forgotten, fear that the home he built would become a place no one wished to return to. He leaned back against the chair, closing his eyes briefly as another cough escaped his chest. In that moment of stillness, he admitted to himself what he had long refused to face. He had lost the right to expect his sons to come back willingly. Years of control, silence, and unresolved conflict had quietly erased that privilege. Pride had once guided his decisions, but now it left him empty-handed. He knew he could no longer demand their presence, nor could he command their concern. The thought frightened him more than any illness ever could. As the house remained motionless around him, a desperate idea formed, one born not of malice, but of weakness. If he could not bring them back with truth, perhaps he could do so with fear. If he could not earn their return, perhaps he could force fate's hand. Pretending to be gravely ill felt like the only path left, the last card he could play to gather his scattered family before it was too late. The decision, once made, settled heavily in his chest. He began to act carefully, calculating every step. The news would not be dramatic, nor would it be clear. It needed to sound serious enough to alarm, yet vague enough to avoid scrutiny. Messages were sent quietly, words chosen with restraint. He was not dying, but he was not well. Doctors were concerned. Time was uncertain. That was all they needed to hear. Soon enough, the information reached both James and Hung. No explanations, no details, just a single implication that lingered between the lines. There might not be much time left. James received the news in the middle of an ordinary day, one that was suddenly no longer ordinary. His phone buzzed, and the moment he read the message, the world around him seemed to slow. He stood still, the noise of life fading into the background as memories rushed forward uninvited. His childhood resurfaced in fragments, arguments left unresolved, expectations that suffocated rather than guided, and a distance that grew quietly but steadily over the years. His relationship with his father had never healed. It had merely paused. Now, that pause was being threatened by something irreversible. He felt anger, confusion, and guilt collide within him. Part of him wanted to stay away, to protect himself from reopening wounds that never fully closed. Another part of him knew that walking away now might become a regret he could never outrun. The word father carried weight, regardless of the pain attached to it, and James found himself trapped between the instinct to shield his heart and the responsibility that came with being a son. That evening, James told Tu Diep. He spoke quietly, choosing his words carefully, though his voice betrayed his inner turmoil. Tu Diep listened without interrupting, her expression calm and attentive. She did not ask questions about the past, nor did she attempt to judge the situation. Instead, she focused on James, on the tension in his shoulders, on the way his hands clenched unconsciously as he spoke. To her, the matter was not about whether Mr. Hoan deserved forgiveness or whether his actions in the past could be excused. What mattered was James's state of mind and the heavy burden he now carried. She understood that unresolved relationships had a way of lingering long after opportunities to mend them were gone. When James fell silent, Tu Diep spoke gently. She did not push him toward reconciliation, nor did she suggest confronting old wounds. Her words were simple, steady, and rooted in compassion. She told him that returning was not about forgiving or forgetting. It was about fulfilling his duty as a son, about standing by his father when illness loomed, so that one day, regardless of how things turned out, James would not look back with regret. She reminded him that choosing to go did not erase the pain of the past, but choosing not to might deepen it. Her voice carried no pressure, only reassurance, offering him clarity rather than direction. After a long silence, James made his decision. He would go back, not to resolve everything, not to reopen old arguments, but to do what he felt was right. Tu Diep did not hesitate. She told him she would go with him, not as a mediator, nor as someone seeking answers, but as his wife, ready to stand beside him and take on the role expected of her. She understood that returning to his family meant more than a visit. It meant responsibility, patience, and restraint. As a daughter-in-law, she was prepared to care for the household, to offer support quietly, and to respect boundaries that were not hers to cross. Back at the old house, Mr. Hoan prepared himself for their arrival. He adjusted his posture, slowed his movements, allowed exhaustion to show more openly. Every detail mattered. The way he sat, the way he spoke, even the pauses between his breaths. Yet beneath the performance, his emotions were real. He felt a nervous anticipation he had not known in years. The idea of seeing James again filled him with both hope and fear. Hope that his plan would succeed, fear that he might lose what little trust remained if the truth ever surfaced. When James and Tu Diep finally arrived, the atmosphere shifted instantly. James froze for a moment at the doorway, struck by how much older his father looked. The man before him seemed smaller, more fragile, and undeniably human. The sight softened something inside him, stirring emotions he thought he had buried. Tu Diep, standing beside him, remained composed. She greeted Mr. Hoan politely, her tone respectful and warm. She asked about his health, offered to help with daily routines, and began organizing the household without drawing attention to herself. There was no suspicion in her eyes, no probing questions, only sincerity. During their first proper conversation, Tu Diep sat beside Mr. Hoan, listening as he spoke. She asked about his comfort, his medication, his appetite. Small, practical concerns delivered with genuine care. Mr. Hoan watched her quietly, taken aback by her presence. There was no tension in her behavior, no hidden agenda. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he had not anticipated. Gratitude, not because his plan was working, but because the warmth she brought into the house felt real. As she adjusted a cushion behind his back and spoke softly, Mr. Hoan felt the house breathe again, as if life had cautiously returned, and in that fragile moment, surrounded by the quiet care of a daughter-in-law who asked for nothing in return, He wondered how long he could continue living behind a truth that was never meant to remain hidden, because even as James stood nearby, struggling silently with emotions he could barely name, and Tu Diep moved calmly through the room, fulfilling her role without hesitation, the weight of what was coming next already lingered in the air, waiting for the moment when the fragile balance they had just begun to form would inevitably be tested by the arrival of Hoan, and the truth that had not yet been spoken but was already pressing against the walls of the house, growing heavier with each passing breath and each unspoken word. As the family unknowingly stood on the edge of a confrontation that would force every one of them to face not only the lie that brought them back together, but also the deeper question of whether duty alone could truly mend what had been broken when silence ruled for far too long, and the past refused to stay buried beneath the surface of the present while the night slowly settled outside and the story continued without pause because the next step was already unfolding, and none of them were prepared for what would come when the fragile calm finally gave way, and the door would soon open again, and the tension that had been carefully held back would no longer be able to remain contained, and the consequences of Mr. Hoan's choice would begin to reveal themselves in ways that no one in that room could yet fully understand or escape, as the sound of footsteps approached, and the moment they had all been unconsciously waiting for was about to begin. And everything that followed would change the meaning of family for each of them forever, as the silence broke, and the next chapter moved forward without offering an ending. Yet James found himself struggling with the simplest actions: pouring a glass of water, adjusting a blanket, asking whether his father felt cold. Every small gesture felt unfamiliar, as though he were stepping into a role he had never rehearsed. He hovered near Mr. Hoan's side, unsure when to speak, unsure when to step back. The distance between them was not measured in physical space but in years of silence, and each attempt to close it felt awkward and fragile. Tu Diep noticed this immediately. She did not intervene directly, nor did she push James forward. Instead, she moved quietly around them, creating moments where father and son were left alone together without pressure. She would excuse herself on purpose, suggest James sit closer, or ask him to help with something simple, giving him a reason to stay. Her support was subtle, almost invisible, but it carried weight. James began to sit longer beside his father, listening more than speaking, learning how to be present without reopening old wounds. The house changed when Hoan arrived. He came later than James, his return deliberate rather than impulsive. His expression was guarded as he stepped inside, eyes scanning the familiar space with calculated awareness. Unlike James, Hoan did not allow emotion to lead him. He observed everything: the way their father spoke, the rhythm of his breathing, the careful concern in Tu Diep's movements, and most of all, the visible change in James. There was a softness in his brother that Hoan had not seen in years. It unsettled him. While he greeted everyone politely, his mind remained alert, quietly measuring what he saw against what he knew. For a brief period, the household settled into an uneasy calm. Meals were shared. Conversations were simple. No one raised their voice or brought up the past. The family sat together at the dining table, something that had not happened in a long time. Tu Diep took on the role of connector without drawing attention to herself. She prepared the food, guided the conversation toward neutral ground, and made sure no one felt excluded. Her presence softened the atmosphere, filling the silence with warmth rather than tension. Even Mr. Hoan seemed lighter during these moments, his eyes lingering on his sons as if memorizing the sight of them together. To an outsider, it might have appeared peaceful, almost ordinary, but beneath the surface, each person carried their own unspoken thoughts. Hoan's doubts grew quietly. Certain details did not align. the timing of medications, the strength in his father's voice when he thought no one was listening, moments where fatigue vanished too easily. Hoan did not confront anyone. He chose silence, gathering fragments of observation, allowing suspicion to form without accusation. He watched how Tu Diep cared for their father with consistency and respect, never questioning, never demanding explanations. That only deepened his internal conflict. If the illness was false, then the kindness around it was real, and that imbalance troubled him. Tu Diep continued her daily routine without deviation. She handled the medication schedule, prepared meals suited to Mr. Hoan's condition, and ensured the household ran smoothly. She did not ask about the past, nor did she inquire into the details of the illness. To her, caring for her father-in-law was not conditional. It was not tied to truth or deception. It was a duty she accepted fully, without expectation of gratitude or resolution. Her actions were steady, grounded, and sincere, and over time, Mr. Hoan began to feel the weight of that sincerity pressing against the lie he had constructed. James watched this quietly. Seeing Tu Diep move through the house with calm dedication changed him. The anger he had carried for so long began to loosen its grip. His father's weakened state, combined with the steady presence of his wife, allowed him to see the situation through a different lens. He still remembered the hurt. He still felt the distance. But now, those emotions were layered beneath a sense of responsibility he could no longer ignore. He realized that regardless of how things turned out, he was here. He was doing what he believed was right. That understanding did not erase the pain, but it gave it context. The moment of confrontation arrived without warning. Hoan chose the timing carefully, when everyone was present. His voice was calm, controlled, but firm. He addressed his father directly, laying out the inconsistencies one by one. The room fell silent as each detail landed with precision. Mr. Hoan attempted to deflect at first, but the weight of the truth pressed too heavily. There was no escape left. When he finally admitted that he had exaggerated his condition, the confession hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. James felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The realization that his emotions had been manipulated cut deeply. Pain surged through him, not only anger, but grief for the vulnerability he had allowed himself to feel. Yet beneath that pain was something else, a quiet certainty. He had come back, he had stayed, he had cared for his father when he believed the situation was genuine. No lie could take that away from him. His sense of duty had been fulfilled, and that realization anchored him even as disappointment washed over him. Tu Diep remained composed. She did not raise her voice. She did not express anger or betrayal. Instead, she acknowledged the truth with calm acceptance. She spoke gently, stating that her actions had never depended on whether the illness was real. Caring for her father-in-law had been the right thing to do, regardless of circumstance. Her words carried no judgment, only clarity. In that moment, her presence became the emotional center of the room, steadying what might otherwise have collapsed. Mr. Hoan finally spoke without pretense. He admitted his fear of growing old alone, fear of dying without seeing his sons again, fear of being forgotten. He confessed that he lacked the courage to face them honestly, believing that illness was the only way to bring them back. His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with shame. For the first time, the truth was not hidden behind performance. Tu Diep addressed both brothers then, her tone gentle but firm. She reminded them that while the method had been wrong, the fear behind it was human. She did not ask them to forgive, nor did she urge reconciliation. Instead, she encouraged them to see the situation with compassion, to separate the act from the emotion that drove it. Her words did not resolve the conflict, but they softened its edges, allowing space for reflection rather than immediate judgment. The family did not emerge from that moment healed. James remained distant, his trust shaken. Hoan kept his guard up, his skepticism unchanged. But something fundamental had shifted. The lie was exposed, and with it, the fragile illusion holding them together was gone. What remained was choice. Choice to stay, choice to leave, choice to rebuild or let go. In the days that followed, life continued in a quieter rhythm. James stayed, though forgiveness remained out of reach. Hoan kept his distance, both physically and emotionally. Tu Diep continued her role without change, caring for the household with the same calm dedication. Mr. Hoan watched them all with a new understanding. His plan had succeeded in bringing them back, but it had also revealed a truth he could no longer ignore. Family could not be forced into closeness. Love, respect, and forgiveness were not outcomes of manipulation. They were gifts, given only when someone was ready to offer them. And so the house stood once more, filled with people but heavy with unspoken thoughts, each of them carrying a different understanding of what it meant to be a family, knowing that while duty could bring them together, only time and honesty could decide whether they would ever truly find their way back to one another again. This story follows Mr. Hoan, an aging father who pretends to be gravely ill to draw his estranged sons, James and Hoan, back home. Haunted by loneliness and regret, he believes fear is his last chance to reunite the family. James returns in emotional conflict, guided by his wife Tu Diep, who encourages him to fulfill his duty as a son without demanding forgiveness. Tu Diep quietly cares for Mr. Hoan as a devoted daughter-in-law, bringing warmth and stability to the household. Hoan arrives later, observant and suspicious, noticing inconsistencies in their father's condition. As family life briefly settles into fragile calm, Hoan eventually confronts the truth. Mr. Hoan confesses his deception, driven by fear of dying alone. James feels hurt, yet realizes he has honored his responsibility. Tu Diep responds with calm compassion, urging understanding without forcing reconciliation ahead.